Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of Cornwall on a gray spring morning. The mist clings to the hedgerows like whispered secrets, and the narrow country roads wind through landscapes that have witnessed centuries of quiet living. It was on such a morning that death came riding on the back of a mechanical digger. The driver was an ordinary man, someone you might pass in the village shop without a second glance. He'd been hauling heavy machinery for 15 years, moving excavators and bulldozers from one construction site to another. His low-loader truck was his livelihood, and he took pride in securing his loads properly, or so he thought. On this particular morning, as he wound his way through the serpentine roads of Cornwall, something was terribly wrong. A locking pin, perhaps no bigger than your thumb, had worked itself loose. A safety strap had frayed beyond its breaking point. Some small, seemingly insignificant component had failed in the darkness before dawn. The mechanical excavator, chained and strapped to his flatbed, began its deadly dance as the truck leaned into each curve. At first, it was just inches, the massive boom arm shifting almost imperceptibly with each turn. The driver, high in his cab with the diesel engine thundering beneath him, noticed nothing amiss. But physics is a patient and unforgiving force. With each bend in the road, the digger's arm swung a little further. The bucket, still caked with dried earth from yesterday's work, began to reach across the yellow line like a giant's fist seeking something to crush. When the truck rounded that final blind corner, turning left into destiny, the bucket swung wide into the oncoming lane. It hung there at windshield height, a 5-ton pendulum of steel and earth, waiting for its first victim. The collision lasted less than a heartbeat. The first car, a small hatchback driven by a man heading to his office job, met the bucket head-on. The impact was surgical in its precision and horrific in its outcome. The roof peeled away like the lid of a tin can, and the driver's life ended with the swift, terrible efficiency of industrial machinery meeting human flesh. But the nightmare had only begun. The truck continued forward, the driver still unaware, as the digger's arm gained momentum. Each subsequent turn made it swing wider, faster, hungrier. Car after car fell victim to this mechanical reaper, their roofs sheared away, their occupants meeting death in the bright morning light. By the time a frantic motorist finally flagged down the truck driver, 5 souls had been claimed. 5 ordinary people, parents, workers, someone's child returning from university, had begun their morning with the simple intention of reaching their destinations. None would arrive. When the police pulled the driver from his cab, he collapsed to his knees on the tarmac, repeating the same words like a broken prayer. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. The investigation would later reveal the mechanical failure, a simple, preventable oversight that cost 5 lives. But for the driver, the technical details mattered little. In his mind, he had become death's unwitting charioteer, and no amount of legal absolution could cleanse that stain from his conscience. The authorities committed him to psychiatric care within weeks. Nurses reported that he would sit by his window each dawn, whispering names that never appeared in any newspaper, names of people he'd never met, but whose faces he claimed to see in his dreams. He spoke of their morning routines, their families, their unfulfilled plans, as if their final moments had somehow burned themselves into his memory. One gray morning, he attempted to end his suffering with a plastic breakfast knife, but even death seemed to reject him. He survived, but something fundamental had broken inside him. The part that allows a man to believe he deserves to continue existing in a world where such senseless tragedy is possible. The incident faded from headlines, overshadowed by larger tragedies and newer horrors. But in Cornwall, the locals remember. They remember the morning when death came riding on ordinary wheels, carried by an ordinary man who wanted nothing more than to finish his route and return home to his family. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that lurk in shadows or haunt abandoned places. Sometimes, they are made of steel and earth and human error, rolling down country roads on perfectly ordinary mornings, waiting for the smallest failure to transform routine into catastrophe. The families of the victims received settlements, of course. Money that could never restore a father's embrace or a mother's laugh. And somewhere in a quiet facility, a broken man still sits by his window, watching the road, carrying the weight of 5 deaths that physics and fate conspired to place upon his shoulders. Story 2. There are places in this country where the night seems to press closer than it should, where the familiar becomes strange under the weight of darkness and isolation. Rural exit ramps are among these places, those forgotten arteries where interstate highways bleed into farmland, where the constant rush of traffic gives way to cornrows and cricket songs. It was at such a place that our driver found himself at 4 a.m, pulled off for his mandatory rest break. The highway stretched empty in both directions, its occasional travelers marked only by distant headlights that appeared and vanished like fireflies. Above, a full moon hung like a watchful eye, casting everything in silver and shadow. The trucker had chosen this spot carefully, a wide shoulder beside a cornfield, far enough from the road to avoid the wash of passing vehicles, but close enough to reach safety if needed. He settled into his cab, scrolling through his phone, letting the silence of the rural night settle around him like a familiar blanket. It was then that he noticed the figure standing perhaps 50 yards away at the edge of the cornfield was what appeared to be a human silhouette. Perfectly still, perfectly positioned, it stood among the tall stalks like a sentinel. The trucker's first thought was logical. Farmers often placed scarecrows in their fields, and this was clearly what he was seeing. Just a bundle of straw and old clothes, designed to ward off crows and other pests. But as the minutes ticked by, something about the figure began to trouble him. It was too perfectly formed, too precisely human in its proportions. And though he told himself he was imagining things, it seemed to be facing directly toward his truck, as if aware of his presence. The trucker tried to focus on his phone, on the mindless videos that usually helped him relax before sleep. But his eyes kept drifting back to the figure in the field. Had it moved? Was it closer than before? In the uncertain moonlight, it was impossible to tell. When nature called, he debated using a bottle rather than stepping outside. The rational part of his mind mocked his unease. It was just a scarecrow, after all, a harmless collection of farm debris arranged to resemble a person. But every primitive instinct he possessed screamed warnings he couldn't articulate. Finally, practical needs overcame irrational fears. He stepped out of his cab and walked to the space between his truck and trailer, the familiar ritual of a long-haul driver's life. The night air was cool against his skin, filled with the rustic sense of earth and growing things. But something made him look, against every voice of reason, against his own firm intention to ignore the scarecrow. He turned his head toward the cornfield. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. The figure was gone. Where it had stood moments before, there was now only empty space between the cornstalks. No depression in the earth, no sign that anything had ever been there. Just the gentle rustling of leaves in a breeze he couldn't feel. The trucker didn't hesitate. Whatever primitive alarm was clanging in his brain, he obeyed it without question. He scrambled back into his truck, fired the engine, and pulled onto the highway with the desperate urgency of prey fleeing a predator. His violation of rest period regulations seemed insignificant compared to the certainty that staying meant facing something his mind couldn't properly process. 40 minutes later, he reached a well-lit truck stop filled with other drivers, other human beings going about their ordinary routines. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally, to consider what he might have seen or thought he had seen. Had it been a scarecrow that had fallen over, a shadow cast by passing clouds, or had something else been watching him from that cornfield? Something that wore the shape of a scarecrow, but possessed the intelligence to hide when observed directly. He never returned to that exit ramp. There are some questions that don't need answers, some mysteries that are better left unsolved. In the vast network of American highways, there are enough well-lit stopping places, enough busy truck stops, enough safe harbors that a wise driver need never venture into the uncertain territories, where moonlight plays tricks and cornfields keep their secrets. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights, when his route takes him past similar rural exits, he finds himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, refusing to look toward whatever might be standing motionless in the fields, waiting with the patience of straw and shadow for another curious soul to notice its presence. Story 3. The Navajo Desert holds secrets that predate maps and highways, mysteries that stretch back to times when the only travelers crossed on foot or horseback. It's a landscape of such vastness that civilization seems like an afterthought, a few ribbons of asphalt cutting through territories that belong to older, stranger inhabitants. Our trucker had driven these routes before, hauling freight across the Southwest's endless miles. He knew the loneliness of desert highways, the way night fell like a curtain across the Badlands, transforming familiar landmarks into alien geometries. But familiarity bred a certain confidence, and when exhaustion demanded rest, he pulled off onto a dirt turnabout between Cameron and Page, deep in the heart of Navajo country. The spot seemed perfect, far enough from the highway to avoid traffic noise, surrounded by open desert that stretched to distant mesas, outlined against the star-drunk sky. He settled into his sleeper cab with the satisfaction of a man who had found the ideal place to grab a few hours of rest before continuing his journey. Sleep came easily in the perfect silence of the desert night. No city lights, no industrial hum, just the vast quiet that exists in places where human presence is measured in decades between visits rather than minutes between cars. It was the kind of silence that city dwellers pay thousands to experience at meditation retreats. The absence of sound, so complete it seemed to have weight. But at 2 a.m, something shattered that perfect quiet. 3 scratches, deliberate, rhythmic, unmistakable. They came from just outside his window, as if something with claws was testing the metal skin of his truck. The trucker's eyes snapped open, his body instantly alert despite the deep sleep he'd been enjoying moments before. In the darkness of his cab, he lay perfectly still, listening with every fiber of his being. The scratching came again, slow, methodical, almost playful in its persistence. It moved along the side of his truck, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper, more purposeful. His hand found the knife he kept clipped to his belt, though what good a blade would do against an unknown threat in the middle of nowhere, he couldn't say. The scratching continued for 15 minutes, long enough to confirm that this was no accidental contact, no branch blown against his truck by desert winds. Something was out there, something with intent and intelligence, marking its presence on his temporary shelter. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scratching. It pressed against his eardrums like a living thing, heavy with potential and threat. He forced himself to wait, to count off another 15 minutes before daring to peek through the edge of his curtain. The desert stretched away in all directions, empty and silver under the moon's cold light. Nothing moved in that vast landscape except the gentle shifting of sand in the breeze. No figure, no animal, no explanation for what had circled his truck in the darkness. But morning brought evidence that the night's visitor had been real. Footprints led from the brush directly to his truck, circled it completely, then led back into the desert's heart. They were human in shape, but somehow wrong in detail. Too long, perhaps, or pressed too deeply into the hard-packed earth. Most unsettling of all was their destination. The prints led straight into the deepest part of the desert, toward Badlands, where no sane person would venture on foot, especially at night. They suggested someone or something that called that hostile landscape home, that moved through it with the confidence of a creature in its natural element. The trucker never learned what had visited him that night. Local folklore spoke of skinwalkers and desert spirits, of things that walked the old paths between sacred places. But he was a practical man who dealt in freight schedules and fuel economy, not supernatural explanations. What he knew, for certain, was that some places exist beyond the reach of human comfort, territories where our presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. The desert had shown him its true face that night, not the scenic backdrop for tourism brochures, but an ancient landscape that remembers when his species were newcomers, walking carefully and leaving offerings for things they couldn't understand. Now, when his roots take him through similar territory, he chooses truck stops over solitary rest areas, artificial light over natural darkness. There are some mysteries that don't need solving, some visitors that are better avoided than met. The desert will always be there, patient and eternal, watching the highways we've carved through its domain with the same attention it once paid to wagon trains and hunting parties. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, something still walks out from the Badlands to investigate the strange metal creatures that rest briefly in its territory before fleeing back to the safety of human civilization. Story 4. There are stretches of highway in eastern Washington where civilization seems like a distant memory, where the road cuts through landscapes so empty they might as well exist on another planet. These are the routes that test a driver's resolve, mile after mile of nothing but asphalt and wilderness, punctuated only by the occasional dirt turnoff that leads to places unmarked on any map. It was on such a route that our trucker found himself after hours of driving through country so desolate it seemed to swallow sound itself. The massive dirt areas that appeared every 40 miles or so were a blessing to long-haul drivers, safe places to pull off and rest away from the narrow shoulders of the state road. He chose his spot carefully, parking well back from the highway in a clearing surrounded by scrub brush and stunted trees. The isolation was exactly what he needed. No traffic noise, no lights, just the profound quiet that comes with being truly alone in the wilderness. After securing his truck and settling into his sleeper cab, he drew the curtains and lay down to watch something on his phone. The routine was familiar and comforting. A few videos to unwind, then sleep until dawn. He'd done this hundreds of times in dozens of states, and the ritual never failed to relax him. But tonight would be different. The first attempt came after about an hour of peaceful rest. The sound was unmistakable. Someone trying the handle of his driver's side door, the metal mechanism clicking as it was tested from outside. The trucker's blood chilled instantly. He hadn't heard any vehicles approach, hadn't seen any headlights sweep across his curtained windows. He lay perfectly still, listening with every nerve in his body. Then came the sound from the passenger side, the same testing of the door handle, the same deliberate attempt at entry. Whatever was out there had moved around his truck without making a sound. Heart hammering, he started his engine and hit the lights, flooding the immediate area with illumination. Through the gaps in his curtains, he could see ... nothing. No figure crouched by his doors, no vehicle parked nearby, no sign of human presence anywhere within the reach of his headlights. The logical part of his mind suggested wind, debris, something natural that could explain the sounds. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive in darker times, was screaming warnings he couldn't ignore. He forced himself to calm down, to rationalize what he'd heard. The wind could move objects against his truck, create sounds that resembled human activity. This was empty country, after all. The chances of encountering another person were virtually zero. But then came the scratching at his sleeper vents. This time there was no mistaking the sound for anything natural. Fingernails or claws were working at the external vents of his sleeping compartment, accompanied by the renewed clicking of his door handles. The truck began to rock slightly, as if someone was climbing on it, testing its surfaces for entry points. He hit the alarm, hoping to startle away whatever was harassing him. But instead of retreating, the activity intensified. The door handles clicked more rapidly. The scratching became more insistent. And now there were tapping sounds on his windows, rhythmic, purposeful, almost mocking in their persistence. Then came the sound that nearly stopped his heart, the hiss of air escaping from his suspension system. Something was tampering with his truck's vital systems, trying to disable his ability to escape. The activity stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the absolute silence that followed, he could hear only his own ragged breathing and the thunder of his pulse in his ears. Minutes passed. Like hours before, he heard the distant sound of another truck approaching on the highway. Whatever had been tormenting him apparently heard it too, because the presence, if presence it was, seemed to withdraw. The other truck passed without stopping, but its brief passage seemed to break the spell that had held him captive in his own cab. He waited until dawn before emerging, and when he did, he found no footprints, no disturbed earth, no sign that anyone had been near his truck. But on every window, he discovered something that made his skin crawl, tiny handprints, as if made by a small child who had licked their palm and pressed it repeatedly against the glass. The prints were too small to have been made by an adult, too numerous to have come from a single child, and too perfectly preserved to have been there when he'd parked. They covered every piece of glass on his truck, windows, mirrors, even the clearance lights. Dozens upon dozens of small, wet handprints that caught the morning light like accusatory fingerprints. He cleaned them off with trembling hands and left that place as quickly as his truck would carry him. To this day, he can't explain what happened that night in the Washington wilderness. He knows only that some places exist outside the comfortable boundaries of rational explanation. Territories where the rules that govern civilized life simply don't apply. Now, when his roots take him through similar, empty country, he chooses truck stops over isolated rest areas, seeks the company of other drivers over the dangerous solitude of the back roads. There are some mysteries that don't bear investigation, some encounters that are better left unfinished, because in the deepest wilderness, far from the safety of cities and the comfort of crowds, there are things that move in the darkness with purpose and intelligence, things that mark their territory with the handprints of children who were never children, who test the doors of travelers foolish enough to venture into places where human presence is an intrusion rather than a right. Story 5. The motorway between Edinburgh and London is one of Britain's busiest arteries, a ribbon of concrete and asphalt that carries thousands of travelers daily between Scotland's capital and England's heart. It's a route so familiar to regular drivers that they navigate it almost unconsciously, marking progress by service stations and exit numbers rather than landmarks. For professional drivers, the M74 and A1 become as familiar as their own neighborhoods. They know every junction, every truck stop, every safe place to pull over for mandatory rest breaks. It was this familiarity that made what happened to our trucker so deeply unsettling. The disruption of routine by something so far outside normal experience that it challenged everything he thought he knew about the civilized world. The first sighting seemed innocuous enough. Glancing to his right as traffic flowed alongside him, he noticed a car in the adjacent lane carrying 2 occupants. The passenger was a woman with what he later described as an unmistakable bun, hair pulled severely back in a style that seemed somehow old-fashioned. But it was her expression that caught his attention and held it. Her face was turned toward his truck, her features twisted in what could only be described as terror. Her mouth was open as if she were screaming, though no sound could penetrate the noise of highway traffic and sealed windows. Her eyes were wide with an fear so pure and desperate that it seemed to reach across the space between their vehicles like a physical force. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and he saw in her gaze a plea so profound it made his chest tighten with sympathy. Then the car was gone, disappearing down an exit ramp, leaving him to wonder if he'd misinterpreted what he'd seen. Perhaps it had been an animated conversation, a passenger reacting to something her driver had said. The highway was full of brief human glimpses, after all, moments of connection across the anonymous spaces between vehicles that meant nothing and were quickly forgotten. But 30 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was a different car entirely. Different make, different color, different driver behind the wheel. But the passenger was unmistakably the same woman with the same severe hairstyle, the same expression of absolute terror frozen on her face. She was looking directly at him again, her mouth open in what appeared to be a silent scream, her hands pressed against the passenger window, as if she were trapped behind glass that might as well have been prison bars. The trucker's confusion deepened into concern. 2 different cars, 2 different drivers, but the same terrified passenger. It seemed impossible, yet he was certain of what he was seeing. The woman's face was too distinctive to mistake, her expression too memorable to forget. Again, the car vanished before he could react, leaving him to question his own perceptions. Was fatigue playing tricks on his mind? Had he somehow conflated two separate incidents into one impossible scenario? He considered pulling over to report what he'd seen, but what could he tell the police? That he'd seen the same woman in two different cars, looking frightened. They'd assume he needed sleep more than their assistance. 4 hours later, as he approached London, it happened a third time. Now there could be no doubt. A third car, a third driver, but the same woman with the same unmistakable bun, the same expression of desperate terror. This time she appeared to be screaming at him through the window, her hands beating against the glass, her face contorted with an urgency that transcended the barriers between their vehicles. This time he acted, pulling into the next levee. He called the police with shaking hands, trying to explain what he'd witnessed. The operator listened with professional patience as he described the woman, the cars, the impossible repetition of the encounter. To his relief, he learned that his call was the fourth such report they'd received that day. Other drivers had seen the same thing, the same woman, the same expression of terror, the same impossible appearance in multiple vehicles. The police were taking the reports seriously, treating them as evidence of a genuine emergency rather than the hallucinations of tired drivers. But like so many highway mysteries, this one faded without resolution. The trucker never learned what happened to the woman with the unmistakable bun, never discovered whether she was rescued from whatever situation had put that look of terror on her face. The police investigation seemed to vanish as quickly as the reports that had triggered it, swallowed up in the bureaucratic machinery that handles thousands of similar incidents every year. Sometimes, in the small hours of morning runs down the same stretch of motorway, he finds himself scanning the cars around him, looking for a familiar face in a passenger window, but the woman never appeared again, leaving him to wonder whether he'd witnessed a kidnapping in progress, a human trafficking operation, or something else entirely. Some criminal enterprise that used the anonymity of highway travel to move their victims across the country. The uncertainty haunts him more than any definitive answer might have. In a world where we pass thousands of strangers every day, how many desperate faces do we miss? How many silent screams go unheard behind the glass barriers of our separate vehicles? The highways that connect our cities are also arteries for darker purposes, carrying predators and prey along the same routes that take families on vacation and workers to their jobs. The woman with the unmistakable bun remains a mystery, a glimpse into the shadow world that travels alongside the ordinary world, using the same roads and rest stops and service stations, but for purposes that law enforcement struggles to detect and prevent. She became a reminder that evil often wears the mundane disguise of regular traffic, and that sometimes the most desperate cries for help come not from dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but from the passenger seats of ordinary cars traveling at 70 miles per hour down civilized highways in broad daylight. Story 6. The winding descent down Snowshoe Mountain in Pennsylvania is a stretch of highway that demands respect from even the most experienced drivers. Interstate 80 cuts through thick forests that press close to the roadway, their dark masses creating tunnels of shadow where headlights probe weakly into the gloom. It's beautiful country during daylight hours, but at night it becomes something altogether more primordial, a reminder that civilization is just a thin veneer painted over territories that belong to older, wilder inhabitants. Our trucker had driven this route countless times, hauling freight between the industrial centers of the East Coast. The autumn night was crisp and clear, the kind that makes a driver grateful for his heated cab and thermos of coffee. Traffic was light at this hour, just the occasional set of taillights ahead and the periodic sweep of headlights in his mirrors. He was maintaining a steady pace, respecting the curves and grades that had claimed their share of careless drivers over the years. When he noticed the flatbed truck ahead of him, the driver seemed to be pushing harder than conditions warranted, taking the curves at speeds that made his trailer sway ominously. But professionals generally knew their limits, and our trucker gave him the benefit of the doubt, settling in to follow at a safe distance. The flatbed's taillights grew smaller as the distance between them increased, until they were just red dots dancing through the curves ahead. Our trucker was content to let the other driver set his own pace. The highway was wide enough for different driving styles, and there was no benefit in matching someone else's risky behavior. Then those red dots flared bright. Brake lights blazed in the darkness ahead as the flatbed began a violent dance of destruction. At 70 miles per hour, the truck started fishtailing, its trailer whipping back and forth like the tail of an angry cat. The driver was fighting for control, but physics had already claimed the upper hand. The flatbed veered left tires, screaming protest against asphalt, then shot across the median into the grass. Somehow, miraculously, it stayed upright as the trailer knifed, folding back on itself with the grinding shriek of tortured metal. Our trucker hit his own brakes instinctively, watching in horror as the other vehicle came to rest at an impossible angle, hazard lights beginning their futile blinking in the darkness. 2 other truckers had witnessed the crash, and all 3 men ran toward the wreckage with the grim determination of professionals who understood that minutes could mean the difference between life and death. What they found when they reached the tilted cab was something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The windshield was a spiderweb of shattered glass, caved inward by an impact that had left blood and black fur smeared across the hood. But the source of that impact hadn't died on contact. It had survived, and it was very, very angry. Inside the cab, a black bear thrashed in a space far too small to contain its fury. The massive animal, easily 300 pounds of muscle and claw, had come through the windshield at highway speed and was now trapped in a steel cage with a human being. The driver was still strapped to his seat, his safety harness having become a trap that left him defenseless against the bear's rage. The man's screams were the sounds nightmares are made of, choked, desperate cries that spoke of pain beyond description. His arms, raised in futile defense, were already shredded by claws designed to strip bark from trees and tear apart logs in search of grubs. Blood spurted in arterial sprays as the bear's teeth found their mark again and again. The arrival of a state trooper probably saved the other truckers from attempting a rescue that would have meant their own deaths. The officer took one look at the situation and ran to his cruiser for his service rifle. He approached the passenger side of the cab, ripped open the door, and fired twice into the bear's massive frame. The first shot hit the animal in the shoulder, causing it to rear back with a roar that seemed to shake the very air. The second shot struck lower, perhaps in the gut, but only served to redirect the bear's fury toward this new threat. It lunged toward the open door, toward the trooper who had become its latest target. What followed was a symphony of gunfire as the officer emptied his weapon into the bear's chest. Each shot punctuated by roars that spoke of an intelligence that understood it was dying and intended to take someone with it. Finally, mercifully, the great animal collapsed, its lifeblood pooling on the cab's floor. But their efforts had come too late for the driver. He had been alive when they arrived. His eyes had locked with our truckers for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. But the bear's claws and teeth had done damage that no amount of medical intervention could repair. By the time they pulled him from the wreckage, he was gone, leaving behind only the memory of that final, desperate gaze. The official investigation would blame the accident on the bear crossing the highway at the wrong moment, meeting the truck at the precise point where speed and trajectory created the perfect storm of destruction. Wildlife collisions were common enough on Pennsylvania highways, though rarely with such catastrophic results. But for our trucker, the technical explanations mattered little. What stayed with him was the randomness of it all, the way death could arrive without warning, carried on the back of an animal that had simply been following its own ancient patterns through territory that humans had claimed with roads and regulations. Now, when he drives that stretch of highway, he finds himself scanning the tree line with new vigilance, looking for the telltale gleam of eyes reflecting his headlights. He grips the steering wheel tighter during those dark hours when the forest presses closest to the roadway, when the night seems full of movement just beyond the reach of his vision, because somewhere in those Pennsylvania woods, other bears follow the same trails their ancestors walked for millennia, crossing highways that exist in their territory, whether humans acknowledge it or not. And sometimes, on nights when the stars are hidden and the forest is particularly dark, the laws of physics and the laws of nature converge in ways that transform routine journeys into nightmares of blood and broken glass. The wilderness remembers what came before the highways, and occasionally it sends reminders that our dominion over the landscape is neither complete nor permanent. We share these roads with creatures that were here first, and sometimes they collect a toll that no insurance policy can cover and no amount of careful driving can prevent. Story 7. There are stretches of highway in the American Midwest where the horizon seems to stretch into infinity, where the road runs straight as a ruler's edge through landscapes so flat and featureless they might have been drawn by a child with a crayon. These are the routes that test a driver's endurance, not with dangerous curves or steep grades, but with the hypnotic monotony of endless miles under endless sky. It was on such a highway that Greg encountered the man who would destroy his life with a single, deliberate step. Greg had been driving trucks for over 20 years, hauling freight across the country's midsection with the steady reliability that made him valuable to his company and trusted by his dispatchers. His rig was always clean, his logs always accurate, his deliveries always on time. He was the kind of driver who took pride in his profession, who saw himself as part of the vast network that kept America's economy moving. The night in question found him cruising through Kansas, or perhaps it was Nebraska. In that part of the country, state lines were more theoretical than visible. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon under a cloudless sky, dotted with the occasional pair of taillights or the distant glow of a farm's security lights. At 2:30 in the morning, traffic was almost non-existent. Greg had the road largely to himself, maintaining a steady 68 miles per hour while nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and listening to talk radio turned low. The rhythm of the highway was hypnotic, the gentle vibration of the diesel engine, the soft hiss of tires on asphalt, the steady pulse of mile markers flashing past in his peripheral vision. It was then that he noticed the car on the shoulder. Hazard lights blinked in the darkness ahead, the universal signal of automotive distress. Greg's eyes picked up the disabled vehicle early, as they always did. 20 years of professional driving had trained him to spot potential hazards miles before they became problems. Someone had broken down, run out of gas, or suffered a mechanical failure. It was a common enough sight on the lonely highways of the Midwest. Greg moved slightly left to give the parked car plenty of clearance, following the unwritten code of professional drivers who understood that a moment's inattention could mean the difference between life and death for a stranded motorist. He had no intention of stopping. His schedule was tight, and there were protocols for dealing with highway emergencies that didn't involve random truckers playing Good Samaritan. But as his truck drew, even with the disabled car, its driver's door flew open. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. A man stepped out of the car and directly into Greg's path, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. There was no hesitation, no attempt to avoid the oncoming truck, no sign that he even saw the tons of steel and cargo bearing down on him. Greg had no time to react, no space to swerve, no chance to stop. Trucks are not cars. They don't stop on a dime or change direction at a driver's whim. The laws of physics that make them effective for hauling freight also make them nearly unstoppable once they're in motion. The impact was mercifully brief. The man struck the front grille with a sound that Greg would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. Not the crunch of metal or the screech of brakes, but something more organic, more final. For a moment, the world went silent except for the steady rumble of the diesel engine, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then reality came flooding back. Greg brought his truck to a stop as quickly as its massive momentum would allow, his hands shaking as they gripped the steering wheel. Behind him, the highway stretched, empty and dark, with no sign of what had just occurred, except for the disabled car still blinking its hazard lights, like a beacon marking the spot where someone's life had ended. When the police arrived, they found the body in the median, thrown clear by the impact. The man had died instantly, a small mercy in a situation devoid of comfort. There was no identification, no note, no explanation for what had driven him to step into traffic at 2:30 in the morning on a deserted stretch of highway. The investigation was routine and brief. Greg wasn't charged with any crime. How could he be? Security cameras at a truck stop 20 miles back showed his truck maintaining a steady speed in the right lane. Following all traffic laws, witnesses confirmed that the man had deliberately stepped into traffic. It was, officially, a tragic accident with no one at fault. But official determinations meant nothing to Greg's conscience. In the weeks that followed, he began to experience nightmares that left him waking in cold sweats, his heart hammering with panic. He saw the man's face in every pedestrian, heard the sound of impact in every backfire and door slam. Sleep became elusive, then impossible. His company was understanding at first. They offered counseling, time off, reassignment to local routes. But Greg couldn't climb into his cab without seeing that stretch of dark highway. couldn't grip the steering wheel without feeling it pull against his hands as tons of momentum carried his truck toward its inevitable target. The first time he tried to return to long-haul driving, he made it 50 miles before pulling over to vomit on the shoulder. A state patrol officer found him there, sobbing behind the wheel of a truck he could no longer operate, defeated by memories that replayed with the persistence of a broken record. The diagnosis was post-traumatic stress disorder, but the label did little to ease Greg's suffering. He had become a casualty of someone else's decision to die. Collateral damage in a suicide that had chosen him as its unwitting instrument. The man who had stepped into traffic had ended 2 lives that night, his own and the life of the driver who had been forced to become his executioner. Greg never drove professionally again. The company released him with full benefits and genuine regret. But they couldn't give him back the peace of mind that had died with that unknown man on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. Some wounds go too deep for healing, some traumas too profound for therapy to reach. In the end, Greg learned that evil doesn't always come from malice or criminal intent. Sometimes it comes from despair so complete that it reaches out to destroy innocent bystanders, turning random strangers into unwilling participants in tragedies they never chose and cannot escape. The highways of America carry millions of travelers safely to their destinations every day, but occasionally they become stages for human dramas so devastating that they transform victims into perpetrators, witnesses into participants, and routine journeys into lifelong nightmares that no amount of distance can outrun. Story 8. The Blackwood Highway cuts through some of Montana's most desolate territory, a ribbon of asphalt that connects small towns separated by vast stretches of wilderness. It's the kind of road that appears on maps as a thin line crossing empty spaces, giving no hint of the isolation that awaits travelers. At 5 in the morning, Blackwood Highway belongs to the darkness and whatever calls it home. The sun won't rise for another 3 hours, and even then, it will struggle to penetrate the thick canopy of evergreens that press close to the roadway like spectators at some ancient ritual. It's a place where cell phone coverage becomes theoretical, and the nearest help is measured in hours rather than minutes. Jeremiah had driven this route before, hauling freight between the scattered communities that dot Montana's backcountry. He knew its rhythms and dangers, the places where deer crossed in herds, the curves that could catch an unwary driver, the stretches where fog rolled in like smoke from some invisible fire. But familiarity had bred confidence, or so he thought. The figure appeared in his headlights like a materialization from nightmare, standing in the center of the highway with the casual posture of someone waiting for a bus. At first glance, it seemed to be a man in dirty gray coveralls, the kind of work clothes worn by mechanics or farmers. But as Jeremiah's truck drew closer, details emerged that challenged everything his rational mind wanted to accept. The figure's head was wrong, fundamentally, impossibly wrong. Where a human face should have been, there was instead the unmistakable snout and features of a pig. Not a mask, not some crude disguise, but what appeared to be an actual pig's head grafted onto human shoulders with surgical precision. Jeremiah's first instinct was to swerve around the figure, to treat it as he would any other highway obstacle. But as his truck began to change lanes, the thing moved with inhuman speed and agility. It lunged toward the cab, its arms reaching for the door handle with desperate urgency, and from its throat came a sound that would haunt Jeremiah's dreams for years to come. It was neither fully human nor fully animal, a hybrid vocalization that combined a pig's grunt with a man's scream, creating something that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the primitive fear centers of the brain. The sound was wet and urgent, filled with hunger and need, and a kind of intelligence that suggested this was no random encounter. Jeremiah floored the accelerator, feeling his truck's engine respond with the authority of several hundred horsepower. He didn't look in his mirrors, didn't slow down to process what he'd seen, didn't stop to question whether the encounter had been real or imagined. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had been waiting for him on that dark stretch of highway. Miles passed before he dared to check his mirrors, and when he did, he saw nothing but empty road stretching back into the darkness. No figure in coveralls, no pig-headed apparition, no sign that his encounter had been anything more than a fever dream brought on by too many hours behind the wheel. But when he reached the first gas station on the edge of town, he pulled over with hands that shook too violently to grip the steering wheel properly. His truck showed no signs of the encounter, no handprints on the doors, no scratches in the paint, no evidence that anything had attempted to board his vehicle in the middle of the Montana wilderness. Yet the memory remained vivid and immediate. The image of that pig's head atop human shoulders, the sound of that impossible voice, the way the creature had moved with predatory grace toward his truck. These details had the crystalline clarity of absolute truth rather than the fuzzy edges of nightmare or hallucination. Jeremiah never took the Blackwood Highway again, especially not during the dark hours when normal rules seemed suspended and the wilderness reclaimed territories that humans had marked with roads and mile markers. He found alternate routes that added hours to his journey, but he considered the extra time a small price to pay for peace of mind, because somewhere in the Montana darkness, something waits for travelers who venture too far from the safety of populated areas, something that wears the shape of a man but the head of a beast, something that understands the schedules and patterns of highway traffic well enough to position itself for maximum effect. Local folklore speaks of skinwalkers and shapeshifters, of Native American legends that predate European settlement by centuries. But Jeremiah was a practical man who dealt in bills of lading and delivery schedules, not supernatural explanations for what couldn't be explained. What he knew for certain was that some roads lead to places where the familiar rules don't apply, where the line between human and animal becomes blurred beyond recognition. The highways that cut through America's wildest territories carry more than freight and passengers. They also transport us through regions where older, stranger inhabitants still claim dominion over the landscape. The Blackwood Highway continues to appear on maps, connecting towns whose names most Americans have never heard. Truckers still drive its length, hauling goods to communities that depend on their deliveries, but they do so with heightened awareness, especially during the hours when darkness reigns supreme and the forest presses closest to the roadway. Things still walk that challenge our understanding of what's possible. They wait with the patience of predators for travelers who venture too far from the safety of numbers, who dare to traverse territories that were never truly tamed despite the presence of asphalt and guardrails. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon hides behind clouds and the forest is particularly quiet, They step out of the wilderness to remind passing drivers that not all of America's roads belong entirely to human traffic. Story 9. There are places in America so remote that they exist almost outside the normal flow of civilization, where the distance between neighbors is measured in miles, and the nearest law enforcement is hours away. These are the territories where self-reliance isn't just a virtue, but a necessity, where the wrong kind of person can disappear for years without anyone noticing their absence. It was to such a place that our driver was dispatched to deliver a load of stone, navigating increasingly narrow dirt roads that led deeper into country that seemed to exist in a different century. The ranch sat at the end of a long driveway that wound through brush and scrubland like a scar across the landscape, terminating at a weathered house that looked as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The isolation was complete. No neighbors' houses dotted the horizon. No power lines marked civilization's advance into the wilderness. Just endless sky above and empty land stretching to distant mountains that seemed to mock the idea that humans had any real claim to this territory. The ranch's owner emerged from the house as the delivery truck pulled into the yard, and immediately every instinct the driver possessed began screaming warnings. There was something wrong about the man's energy, not obviously threatening, but off in ways that were difficult to articulate. His smile was too wide, his conversation too animated, his attention too focused and persistent. He stood too close during their interactions, invaded personal space with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned proper social boundaries. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging details about the driver with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. The driver found himself gripping his winch bar a little tighter, positioning himself with clear lines of retreat, following protocols he hadn't consciously learned, but that evolution had burned into his DNA. The unloading proceeded normally at first. Stone by stone, the cargo was transferred from truck to designated spots around the property. But throughout the process, the ranch owner maintained a steady stream of chatter that felt calculated rather than casual, as if he were following a script designed to keep his visitor engaged and off guard. Then came the invitation that made the driver's blood run cold. "You've got to see my basement," the man said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone sharing a treasured secret. "It's the most incredible man cave setup you've ever seen. Come on, just take a quick look. You'll love it." The words were innocuous enough, but they carried undertones that spoke to something deeper and more sinister. There was an insistence in the man's tone, a presumption that his invitation would be accepted, that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd made such an offer to isolated visitors. The driver deflected with professional courtesy, citing schedule constraints and company policies. But the ranch owner wouldn't be deterred. He continued to press the invitation, his approach shifting from enthusiasm to mild annoyance to calculated charm, as if he were testing different strategies to achieve the same goal. No, seriously," he persisted. "You've got to check it out. Come on, real quick, you'll love it." As the conversation continued, the man's comments took on increasingly personal tones. He remarked on the driver's small stature, questioned how someone so tiny could handle such a large truck, made observations about physical attributes that had no place in a professional interaction. Each comment felt like a probe, testing boundaries and reactions. The driver responded by working faster than he ever had before, his hands moving with desperate efficiency to complete the delivery and escape the mounting tension. Normally methodical in his approach to cargo handling, he now operated with the urgency of someone who understood that his safety depended on minimizing the time spent in this isolated location. But the ranch owner seemed to notice the increased pace, and his demeanor shifted accordingly. "No need to rush," he said, his voice dropping to a lower register that carried implications the driver didn't want to contemplate. "You can come inside after. Relax a bit." The suggestion hung in the air like a physical threat, confirming every alarm that had been sounding in the driver's head since his arrival. This wasn't casual hospitality or lonely rancher's conversation. This was something predatory and planned. An invitation that carried consequences the driver had no intention of discovering. When the last stone was unloaded, the driver secured his equipment with record speed, keeping both his winch bar and pepper spray within easy reach, making it clear through body language and tone that the business relationship was concluded and departure was imminent. For the first time since the encounter began, the ranch owner fell silent. His eyes flicked to the weapons the driver carried, and in that moment, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with unspoken threats and unconcealed intentions. The driver didn't wait for the tension to break. He loaded his equipment, climbed into his cab, and drove away with the controlled urgency of someone who understood he'd narrowly avoided becoming a victim of circumstances too horrible to contemplate. When he reported the encounter to his employer, his supervisor initially dismissed it as the eccentricity of rural customers. But when a second driver, a large, intimidating man whom nobody ever troubled, returned from the same location with similar stories and obvious signs of distress, the company quietly removed the location from their delivery routes. The second driver's account was even more disturbing. The ranch owner had used identical tactics, issued the same basement invitation, but when his charm offensive failed, he had physically blocked the driver's truck, trapping him on the property until force became necessary to secure escape. 3 years later, that ranch remains on the company's permanent blacklist, and both drivers still refuse to discuss the details of their encounters. Some invitations are better declined, some basements better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved, where help is hours away and witnesses are non-existent. Predators find perfect hunting grounds among the legitimate businesses and necessary deliveries that keep rural communities functioning. They hide behind ordinary facades, offering normal hospitality that conceals intentions too dark for civilized minds to fully comprehend. The ranch still sits at the end of that long dirt driveway, still receives deliveries from companies whose drivers haven't yet learned to recognize the signs. But somewhere beneath that weathered house, a basement waits with whatever secrets its owner was so eager to share. And the wilderness keeps its silence about the visitors, who may have accepted invitations that others were wise enough to decline. Story 10. There are industrial facilities scattered across America's landscape that operate in the gray zones between civilization and wilderness. Places where legitimate business requires access to remote locations far from the comfort of populated areas. These facilities often operate around the clock, but their isolation makes them islands of artificial light in seas of natural darkness. It was to such a facility near Reno, Nevada, that our trucker found himself dispatched for an early morning delivery. The location was miles off the main highway, reached by a series of increasingly narrow roads that seemed to lead deeper into country that maps marked as empty space. By the time he reached his destination, The lights of Reno were just a distant glow on the horizon, like a memory of civilization viewed from another planet. The facility was locked up tight at 1 in the morning, which was not unusual for operations that relied on automated systems and remote monitoring. A few security lights cast weak pools of illumination across empty parking lots and loading docks, but the overall impression was of a place temporarily abandoned by human presence. Our trucker had delivered 2 similar locations hundreds of times. The routine was familiar: park in a designated area, catch a few hours of sleep in the sleeper cab, then complete the delivery when staff arrived in the morning. He chose a spot away from the main buildings, killed his engine, and settled into his bunk with the satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect place to rest before completing his assignment. The facility's isolation was actually a blessing. No traffic noise, no city lights bleeding through his curtains, just the profound quiet that comes with being truly alone in the wilderness. He closed his eyes and let the familiar sounds of his truck cooling down lull him toward sleep. But sleep would not come easily that night. The first knock came around 2 in the morning, jolting him from the edge of unconsciousness with the violent urgency of someone demanding immediate attention. It rattled his entire truck, as if someone were pounding on his door with both fists, using enough force to rock the vehicle on its suspension. His mind snapped to full alertness, adrenaline flooding his system as he tried to process what he'd heard. The knock had been unmistakably deliberate, not the random impact of windblown debris or settling metal, but the purposeful action of someone who knew he was inside and wanted him to know they were outside. Then it came again, even louder and more insistent than before. The sound seemed to penetrate the steel walls of his cab like a physical force, carrying implications of barely controlled violence. It was the kind of knocking that said, "I know you're in there, and I'm not going away." Heart hammering against his ribs, the trucker fumbled for his door handle. His hands felt clumsy and unresponsive, as if his nervous system was struggling to coordinate movement with thought. Every instinct screamed at him to remain hidden, but logic demanded that he investigate the source of the disturbance. He yanked open his door and leaned out into the night, eyes scanning the area around his truck with desperate intensity. The security lights revealed nothing. No figure crouched by his cab, no vehicle parked nearby, no sign of human presence anywhere within the reach of artificial illumination. The facility's parking lot stretched away into darkness, empty and silent as a graveyard. No movement disturbed the shadows between buildings. No sound broke the absolute quiet that had settled over the location like a suffocating blanket. Had he imagined it? The knocking had seemed so real, so immediate, that his truck still seemed to vibrate with its impact. But the evidence of his senses suggested otherwise. He was alone in a place where being alone should have been impossible. He climbed down from his cab and walked the perimeter of his truck, boots crunching against gravel that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. He checked under the trailer, scanned the shadows between his truck and the nearby buildings, looked for any sign that someone had been attempting to gain access to his vehicle. Nothing. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed gravel, no evidence that anyone had been near his truck since he'd parked it hours earlier. The security lights continued their futile vigil over empty spaces, and the facility's buildings remained as dark and uninhabited as crypts. But as he stood there in the Nevada darkness, a new kind of silence settled around him, not the peaceful quiet of remote places, but the oppressive hush that comes when everything that should be making noise suddenly stops. No wind stirred the desert brush. No distant highway sounds carried across the emptiness. No electronic hum came from the facility's equipment. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't yet revealed itself. The trucker didn't wait to find out what that something might be. Every primitive alarm his species had developed over millions of years of avoiding predators was now screaming at maximum volume. He bolted back to his truck, locked the doors, and fired up the engine with hands that shook so violently he could barely grip the key. He didn't stop driving until he found a truck stop populated with other drivers, other human beings going about their normal routines under bright, artificial lights. Only then did he allow himself to consider what might have happened in that remote parking lot had the knocking been real. His truck had certainly shaken with its impact, and the sound had been too specific, too purposeful to dismiss as imagination. But if someone had been attempting to gain access to his vehicle, where had they gone? And why had they vanished so completely when he investigated? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he'd narrowly escaped something that his conscious mind couldn't fully process. The facility was too remote for random crime, too isolated for casual harassment. Whatever had wanted his attention that night had been operating with purpose and intelligence, following patterns that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic mischief. He never returned to that facility after dark, and in subsequent conversations with other drivers, he learned that he wasn't the first to experience strange encounters at remote delivery locations. The trucking industry was full of stories about places where normal rules seemed suspended, where isolation created opportunities for things that preferred to avoid the scrutiny of populated areas. Some drivers theorized about criminal gangs that targeted truckers in remote locations, using psychological warfare to disorient their victims before moving in for robbery or worse. Others spoke of corporate security systems that malfunctioned in ways that created false alarms and phantom encounters. But our trucker had his own theory, one that he kept to himself because it sounded too much like the plot of a horror movie to share with practical men who dealt in freight schedules and fuel economy. He believed that some places exist at the intersection of civilization and wilderness, territories where human presence is tolerated rather than welcomed, where things that prefer darkness gather to investigate the strange metal creatures that occasionally invade their domain. The facility near Reno continues to operate, continues to receive deliveries from drivers who park in that same remote lot and sleep in their cabs while waiting for morning shifts to arrive. But some of those drivers now report strange dreams, unusual sounds, and the persistent feeling that they're being watched by eyes that reflect no light and leave no tracks in the dust. Because in America's most isolated places, where security lights create small islands of artificial day in oceans of natural night, the boundary between the known and unknown becomes permeable. Things that avoid populated areas find perfect hunting grounds among the industrial facilities and remote operations that keep modern society functioning. And sometimes they announce their presence with sounds that carry messages no human language can translate. The knocking continues, patient and persistent, waiting for travelers who venture too far from the safety of crowds, who dare to sleep alone in places where sleep makes them vulnerable to attention they never wanted, and encounters they're not equipped to survive.